My name is Waverly Carter. I am 26 years old. On the morning after my grandfather's 84th birthday, two men in expensive suits pulled into our dirt driveway and told me we had exactly 4 days to pack up 4 generations of history. My parents did not just skip my grandfather's birthday to sip margaritas in Cancun. They used the trip as an alibi while they secretly sold his 400-acre farm to a corporate conglomerate using a forged power of attorney. I am an actuary. I spend my life analyzing risk and predicting human behavior based on historical data. The math on my own parents was so cold it took my breath away. Before I tell you how a simple manila folder turned their perfect crime into a federal nightmare, I want you to do something for me. Take a moment to like and subscribe and drop a comment below telling me your age and where you are listening from today. Welcome to Fluffy Revenge, where we love seeing the generations that connect with these stories. Now let me take you back to the night before the suits arrived. The kitchen in the farmhouse smelled of stale sugar and aged linoleum. I sat across from my grandfather Silas, watching the wax from a solitary blue candle drip onto the plastic casing of a cheap grocery store sheet cake. The frosting spelled out "Happy Birthday," the letters already bleeding into the white icing. Silas did not look at the cake. He looked out the window toward the silos. His hands rested flat on the table. Those hands mapped 84 years of Kansas dirt drought and harvest. My phone buzzed against the wood. A photo loaded on my screen. It was my mother Diane wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a neon pink margarita. Beside her, my father Richard grinned in a linen shirt unbuttoned too low. The location tag read Cancun. The caption read "Much Needed Getaway." I tapped the screen and locked it before Silas could see. The data on my parents had always trended towards self-interest. They missed Silas turning 80 because they were browsing timeshares in Florida. They missed my college graduation because they found cheap flights to Vegas. But abandoning an elderly man on his birthday, leaving him alone in a farmhouse while they tanned on a beach, felt like a structural shift. A deviation from the baseline. They did not call, Silas said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of self-pity. Reception is bad in Mexico. I lied. We ate the cake in silence. The house ticked around us, settling into the Midwestern night. I assumed the worst thing my parents would do that weekend was forget a phone call. My risk assessment model was flawed. The following morning tasted like dust and diesel. I was in the barn helping Silas organize rusted wrench sets. It was a chore we invented to keep him moving. At 9:15 in the morning, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. A black luxury SUV rolled up the quarter-mile drive, trailing a cloud of fine Kansas topsoil. It parked near the tractor shed. The doors opened and 2 men stepped out. They wore charcoal wool suits and leather dress shoes. Footwear destined to be ruined by the yard. I wiped grease on my denim leg and stepped out of the barn. Silas followed his posture, straightening by habit. The taller man carried a thick folder and offered a brief practice smile. "Silas Carter," he asked. "Who is asking?" Silas replied. His voice was gravel and dry earth. "I am David Keller, Apex Agricultural Holdings." He did not offer a hand. Instead, he extended the folder toward Silas. When my grandfather hesitated, I took it. "We are here to do a preliminary perimeter walk. The demolition crew arrives Friday." The air in my lungs stopped. I opened the folder. The top sheet was a property deed transfer. It listed the 400 acres, the farmhouse, the barns, and the silos. The purchaser was Apex Agricultural Holdings. The purchase price was redacted, but the signature at the bottom was clear in bold blue ink. Richard Carter. Below the signature sat a notary stamp and a single line of text. Executed via power of attorney. I stared at my father's signature. The Cancun trip was not a vacation. It was a calculated evasion tactic. They had sold the ground beneath our feet while we were cutting a cheap birthday cake. "This land is not for sale," I said. My voice leveled into the flat, even tone I used for corporate audits. The man adjusted his cuffs. "It was. As of yesterday afternoon, it is ours. We suggest you start packing." The men in the charcoal suits did not wait for a response. David Keller turned his back to us and gestured for his silent partner to open the rear hatch of the luxury vehicle. I stood in the dirt holding a folder that weighed less than a pound, but carried the death sentence of my family heritage. I flipped past the deed transfer to the second page. The document was a durable power of attorney. My mind categorized the information instantly. 5 years ago, Silas suffered a minor cardiac event while repairing a combine harvester. He spent 3 days in the county hospital. During that scare, my father insisted on drafting a medical and financial power of attorney, claiming it was a necessary precaution for a man in his late 70s running an agricultural operation. Silas signed it just to keep the peace. The document was supposed to sit in a bank vault. A fail-safe meant only for incapacitation. Yet Silas was standing right next to me, breathing steady, his mind sharper than men half his age. I pulled my phone from my back pocket and dialed my father's number. The call routed directly to voicemail without a single ring. 5 seconds later, an automated text message appeared on my screen. Living our best life in Cancun. Out of reach until Sunday. Drink in hand toes in sand. I stared at the cheerful combination of words. My parents were not merely avoiding the fallout. They were hiding behind international borders. A land sale of this scale required corporate escrow title clearance and a significant wire transfer. By leaving the country, they insulated themselves from immediate legal confrontation, while the bank clearing process finalized the deposit into whatever offshore or hidden account they had established. The vacation was a calculated buffer zone. I turned to look at Silas. My chest tightened. I braced myself for the physical toll this betrayal would take on him. He had poured every waking hour into this soil since he returned from the service in 1962. My father was his only son. I expected Silas to lean against the barn door to clutch his chest, or to let grief hollow out his face. Instead, Silas stood very still. His eyes tracked the corporate men near the vehicle. His expression held no sorrow. His gaze was bright, hard, and sharp. He looked less like a victim, and more like a man watching a storm he had forecasted months in advance. A metallic clatter drew my attention back to the vehicle. The second corporate man pulled a canvas bag from the trunk. He unzipped it, revealing a bundle of wooden stakes painted neon pink and a heavy steel mallet. The men walked past the tractor shed and stepped directly into the winter wheat field. This wheat was my grandfather's pride. It represented a generational promise. You nurture the soil and it feeds you in return. The men in their expensive shoes trampled the green shoots without looking down. The partner raised the steel mallet and drove the first pink stake into the ground. The sound echoed across the empty yard. A dull, rhythmic thud. It sounded like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice cut through the crisp morning air. "You are destroying the crop." David Keller paused and rested a hand on his hip. He looked at me with the polite, practiced disdain of a man who viewed the entire state of Kansas as an empty spreadsheet. "The crop is no longer your concern, Miss Carter. We are marking the access road boundaries. The heavy machinery needs a clear path." I felt a sudden sharp urge to march into the field and pull the stake from the earth. I wanted to scream at them to demand they leave the property. But acting on raw emotion is a liability. Emotion makes you predictable. My training as an actuary taught me that panic is simply a lack of data. I needed to control the data. I turned away from the men and carried the folder to the hood of Silas's old pickup truck. I spread the papers flat against the faded red metal. I breathed in the smell of motor oil and cold morning dew. I forced my eyes to stop reading the names and start reading the numbers. I examined the power of attorney execution page. The signature belonged to my father, but the legal weight relied entirely on the notary seal pressed into the bottom corner. A notary public in the state of Kansas must record the exact date, time, and location of the signature to verify the identity and physical presence of the signee. I traced my finger over the raised stamp. The notary was registered in Kansas City. The date of execution was listed as 3 days ago. The timestamp read 8 in the morning. The numbers clashed in my head. 3 days ago, my parents were supposedly rushing to the airport. I had seen their social media posts complaining about the security lines at Wichita National Airport at 7:30 in the morning. Wichita is a 3-hour drive from Kansas City. My father could not have been standing in a Kansas City notary office at 8 in the morning while simultaneously posting a photo from a security line in Wichita. The timeline was fractured. The seal was fraudulent. My father had not simply abused a stale legal document. He had falsified the execution. He likely paid a corrupt notary to stamp the paperwork without him being present, rushing the process to finalize the sale before his flight departed for Mexico. In Kansas, a notary logbook requires a physical signature. If my father was in Wichita and the notary was in Kansas City, the physical logbook would prove the fraud. I filed that fact away in my mind. The breadcrumbs were sloppy. My parents were so eager to secure the cash that they bypassed basic protocols. I felt a cold, clear focus settle over me. This was no longer just a family betrayal. It was a verifiable documented crime. David Keller walked back from the field and wiped a speck of mud from his trousers. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a sealed white envelope. He set it on the hood of the truck right next to my scattered papers. "Notice to vacate," Keller said. His tone remained smooth and unbothered. Apex Holdings assumes full liability and control of the premises effective immediately. Out of respect for your grandfather's age, we are offering a brief grace period to remove personal items from the primary residence. How long, I asked. Keller adjusted his tie. The demolition crew is scheduled for Friday at dawn. The historic barn is structurally unsound and sits directly over the planned excavation site. It comes down first. I suggest you focus your efforts on packing rather than reading. Friday at dawn. That gave us exactly 4 days to reverse a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Keller and his partner returned to their vehicle. The engine hummed to life and the heavy tires crushed the gravel as they drove back down the long driveway. They left behind a line of neon pink stakes bleeding into the green wheat. I stood by the truck, the morning sun warming the metal under my hands. 4 days. My parents were beyond reach, basking on a foreign beach, while bulldozers fueled up to erase my grandfather's legacy. They believed the distance protected them. They believed Silas was too old to fight back and that I was just a girl who worked a desk job. I gathered the papers, aligning the edges perfectly before sliding them back into the manila folder. I turned to Silas. He was still watching the road where the dust from the SUV hung in the air. "Grandpa," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled slightly against the folder. They forged the notary stamp. "We have 4 days before they tear down the barn. I need to call a lawyer. I need to file an injunction." Silas turned away from the road and looked at me. The sharp, lucid glint in his eye had not faded. He did not look panicked. He reached out and placed his rough, calloused hand over mine. "Do not waste your time calling a lawyer." "Waverly," he said quietly. I stared at him, confused by his calm demeanor. "But Grandpa, they are coming on Friday. If we do not fight this right now, we lose everything." Silas offered a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile a chess player wears when the opponent walks into a trap they set 3 moves ago. "We are not going to lose a single blade of grass," he said. "Come inside the house. I have something you need to see." The heavy oak door of my grandfather's study clicked shut, sealing us inside a room that felt entirely separated from the modern world. The air in here always carried a distinct heavy scent. It was a mixture of worn leather from the armchair in the corner, the dry dust of yellowed ledger paper stacked on the bookshelves, and the sharp metallic tang of tractor oil that permanently clung to Silas's boots. This room was the nervous system of the farm. Every seed purchased, every harvest sold, and every drought survived had been recorded in this space over the last 6 decades. Silas walked past the globe near the window and took his seat behind the broad mahogany desk. He did not sink into the chair. He sat upright, his shoulders squared. The fragility I had expected to see in him following the corporate men's departure was absent. "Your father never looked at the dirt," Waverly Silas said. His voice filled the quiet room, steady and clear. Even when he was a boy, Richard hated the harvest. He hated the early mornings and the calluses. When he went off to business school, he learned a new vocabulary. He stopped seeing a farm and started seeing an asset class. He looked at the fields and only saw dormant equity waiting to be liquidated. I stood on the opposite side of the desk, still holding the fraudulent Apex deed. He used the medical power of attorney, Grandpa, the one you signed 5 years ago when you were in the hospital. I know, Silas replied. He folded his hands together. I knew the day he drafted it that he was treating it like a blank check. He thought I was getting senile. He assumed I was too attached to the past to secure the future. But a man does not keep 400 acres through 3 recessions and 2 farm crises by being naive. Silas reached down and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The metal glided smoothly. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It looked similar to the one the corporate men had brought, but this one bore the seal of a local county law firm. Before those suits drove up our road this morning, Silas said, placing the envelope on the desk, someone else came to the house. A courier from town. He arrived just after dawn while you were out back checking the irrigation lines. He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany. Open it. I set the Apex folder down and picked up the new envelope. The paper was crisp. I broke the seal and pulled out a stack of documents. The header on the first page read, Irrevocable Agricultural Conservation Trust. My eyes scanned the legal jargon. My actuarial training automatically sorting the clauses, the conditions, and the dates. The document was executed 3 weeks ago. The date preceded my father's fraudulent notary stamp by 21 days. I read the primary provisions. Silas had formally transferred the entire title of the 400-acre property, including the farmhouse, the barns, and the silos, into the trust. By doing so, he legally removed the farm from his own personal estate. The land no longer belonged to Silas Carter. Therefore, the power of attorney my father used to sell the land on Silas's behalf was worthless. My father had sold an asset his client no longer owned. I kept reading. The trust contained an ironclad conservation easement. The land could solely be used for agricultural cultivation in perpetuity. Any commercial development, excavation, or non-agricultural construction was strictly prohibited. Then I reached the trustee designation. Silas had named one person with total fiduciary control over the entity. Waverly Carter. You gave the farm to me, I whispered. I placed it in your protection. Silas corrected gently. I trust your mind, Waverly. You understand, but you also respect the soil. The trust is impenetrable. My lawyer in town made sure of it. Your parents' contract with Apex Holdings is legally void. A wave of profound relief washed over me. We had the shield. We had the proof. My father's scheme was ruined. I looked up, ready to tell Silas we could just call the sheriff and have the corporate surveyors thrown off the property. But as the initial relief faded, my professional instincts flared. The cold, analytical part of my brain began running the variables, assessing the risk and projecting the timeline. The relief evaporated, replaced by a chilling realization. Grandpa, I said, my voice tightening. This document proves the sale is fraudulent. But Apex Holdings is a billion-dollar conglomerate. They do not operate on ethics. They operate on leverage. Silas frowned slightly. The law is the law, Waverly. The trust predates their deed. Yes, it does. I agreed, tapping the paper. But Apex employs floors of corporate litigators. If we walk out to the gate on Friday morning and wave this trust in their faces, they will not just apologize and drive away. They will file an emergency injunction in a friendly court. They will claim our trust is a forgery, or that you were coerced into signing it. They will drag us into a jurisdictional battle that could take months or even years to resolve. I paced the length of the study, the adrenaline sharpening my thoughts. In the meantime, they will request a temporary order to proceed with their demolition. The justice system is slow, but corporate bulldozers are fast. By the time a judge finally reviews these documents and rules in our favor, the historic barn will be splinters. The topsoil will be paved over. They will bleed us dry in legal fees before the truth ever sees the inside of a courtroom. Silas leaned back in his leather chair. The silence in the room grew heavy, filled only by the distant rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He understood the math. Being right was not enough. The truth was a shield, but the shield could not stop a demolition crew. I looked down at the documents on the desk. The fraudulent deed on the left. The authentic trust on the right. An actuary does not win by fighting force with force. We win by altering the risk profile. If Apex Holdings viewed this farm as a lucrative asset, I needed to transform it into a toxic liability. I needed to make the cost of stepping onto this land so astronomical that their board of directors would recoil in panic. I could not rely on a slow legal system to protect us. I needed to build a trap. A mathematically flawless, inescapable financial trap that would trigger the moment their heavy machinery touched our soil. They want to play a corporate game, I said, quietly staring at the fraudulent signature my father had left on the page. Then we will use corporate rules. I looked at Silas. I need your ledgers. I need every tax return, every soil report, and every county charter dating back to the day you bought this place. If my parents think they can forge a document and hide in Mexico, they have miscalculated the variables. I gathered the authentic trust papers and placed them carefully back into their envelope. My heart beat with a slow, measured rhythm. The surveyors were outside planting their pink stakes. Friday was coming. I had less than 96 hours to dismantle a billion-dollar acquisition. I walked over to the tall wooden filing cabinets lining the far wall of the study. I reached for the brass handle on the top drawer. It was time to run the audit. The kitchen island became my forensic laboratory. I cleared away the floral vinyl tablecloth and hauled 4 heavy steel drawers from my grandfather's study, stacking manila folders, tax returns, and bound ledgers under the harsh fluorescent overhead light. The room smelled of aged paper-dried ink and strong black coffee. I opened my laptop, created a new encrypted spreadsheet, and went to work. I did not view my family as people anymore. I viewed them as data points in a risk matrix. I pulled the fraudulent Apex deed and placed it beside the original medical power of attorney my father had weaponized. My actuarial training relies on spotting deviations in patterns. Financial crimes always leave a structural flaw because liars focus on the final payout, omitting the supporting arithmetic. I spent 3 hours tracing the dates, the signatures, and the corresponding county filings. I found the fracture. 5 years ago, after Silas recovered from his cardiac event, he officially revoked that medical power of attorney. He filed the revocation with the county clerk. My father knew this. The original document was legally dead. To sell the farm to a corporate buyer. My parents needed a living document. They could not use the county records, so they created a ghost. They took a photocopy of the revoked document to a strip mall notary in Kansas City. I zoomed in on the digital scan of the stamp. The notary registration number belonged to a storefront cash advance business. My father paid someone to bypass the state registry, ignore the physical presence laws, and rubber stamp a dead document back to life. The crunch of tires outside interrupted my analysis. It was not the smooth roll of corporate luxury vehicles. It was the heavy, uneven grind of a lifted pickup truck. I walked to the kitchen window and pushed aside the lace curtain. My older brother Trent parked his oversized truck directly on the front lawn, crushing a bed of early spring tulips. Trent was 29 years old. He possessed the unearned confidence of a man who treated every family asset as his personal checking account. While I spent my college years studying statistics and probability, Trent spent his attempting to launch various lifestyle brands that all inevitably required emergency bailouts from our parents. He hopped out of the cab wearing designer sunglasses and expensive boots that had never touched actual mud. He dropped the tailgate and hauled out a thick stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes. I closed my laptop and slid the authentic trust documents into a drawer. I left the fraudulent Apex deed on the table. I needed Trent to feel in control. The front door opened without a knock. Trent dropped the cardboard boxes onto the hallway runner. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet house. "Time to pack it up," he announced, walking into the kitchen. He did not say hello. He did not ask how Silas was doing. He tossed a glossy trifold brochure onto the island right on top of my grandfather's ledger. I picked up the brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of an elderly couple smiling in front of a beige stucco building. The title read Oak Creek Assisted Living. I recognized the name. It was a low-budget state-subsidized facility 2 counties over known for linoleum floors and shared rooms. Mom and Dad booked a bed for the old man, Trent said. He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. The corporate guys are bringing the dozers on Friday. We need this place cleared out by Thursday night. I brought boxes. You pack his clothes. I will handle the valuables. The sheer audacity of his presence clarified the entire operation. My parents did not act alone. Trent was the ground operative. While they established their alibi on a foreign beach, they sent my brother to enforce the eviction. Silas walked into the kitchen from the hallway, leaning slightly on his cane. He looked at the flattened boxes, then at the brochure in my hand, and finally at his grandson. "I am not going anywhere," Trent Silas said. His voice remained remarkably steady. Trent rolled his eyes, sighing with exaggerated exhaustion. "Come on, Grandpa. Do not make this difficult. Dad already signed the papers. The farm is sold. The money is clearing. You cannot stay here. Oak Creek has a nice cafeteria. It is time to let it go." I felt a sharp spike of adrenaline. The old version of me, the younger sister who used to argue with Trent over his endless entitlement, wanted to throw the brochure in his face. I wanted to reveal the trust. I wanted to watch his smug expression shatter into 1,000 pieces. But discipline dictates strategy. You do not interrupt an enemy while they are making a mistake. You encourage them. I slipped my right hand into my pocket, unlocked my phone using facial recognition, and tapped the record button on my voice memo application. "Trent," I said, keeping my voice small and trembling. I let my shoulders drop, adopting the posture of a panicked, overwhelmed sibling. I do not understand how Dad did this. The power of attorney was revoked years ago. Grandpa filed the paperwork at the courthouse. How did Apex accept it? Trent smirked. He uncrossed his arms and picked up an apple from the fruit bowl, polishing it on his expensive shirt. "You always overcomplicate things, Waverly. You think the real world runs on spreadsheets. It runs on handshakes." But the notary, I pushed, stepping closer to ensure the microphone captured every syllable. "The stamp is from Kansas City. Dad was at the Wichita airport. If Apex investigates the timeline, they will know it is a fake. Are you not worried?" Trent took a bite of the apple, chewing with his mouth open. He waved his free hand dismissively. "Apex does not care about timelines. They care about water rights and land access. Dad found a guy in Kansas City who plays ball. $50 and a wink, and the guy stamps whatever you put in front of him. We backdated the logbook. The county clerk will never look twice, and by the time anyone cares, the farm will be a pumping station and Mom and Dad will be retired." I kept my expression wide and fearful while my mind cataloged his exact phrasing. He used the plural pronoun. We backdated the logbook. Trent was not just an errand boy. He was a co-conspirator. He had just confessed to participating in document forgery and real estate fraud on a recorded device. "I just feel sick about this, Trent," I whispered, looking down at the floor. "Get over it," he scoffed. He tossed the half-eaten apple into the sink. "Start packing the kitchen. I am going to the study to box up the antique clocks." As Trent turned his back to walk down the hall, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dim hallway. I watched his thumbs fly across the digital keyboard, typing a rapid response. "Tell Mom the boxes are here," he muttered to himself, assuming I was too paralyzed by anxiety to notice his actions. I stood frozen by the kitchen island, the recording still running in my pocket. Trent disappeared into the study. The sound of packing tape ripping off a roll echoed through the house. I looked at Silas. My grandfather met my gaze. He had watched the entire performance without breaking character. He gave me a single, slow nod. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. The audio file was pristine. I had a confession. But an audio recording of my brother boasting in a kitchen was not enough to trigger a federal investigation or force a corporate giant like Apex Holdings to abandon a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I needed the structural foundation of the crime. I needed the digital trail. My parents were thousands of miles away in another country. The corrupt notary was hours away in a city of 500,000 people. The operation required coordination. It required scanned documents, bank routing numbers, and scheduled payments. My parents were not tech-savvy enough to orchestrate a secure, untraceable communication network. They used text messages. They used emails. They left a footprint. And the bridge to that digital footprint was currently sitting in my brother's pocket. Trent's phone was the key. It held the direct communications with my father. It held the location data for the Kansas City notary. It held the banking details for the offshore account, waiting for the Apex wire transfer. I needed his phone. But Trent was 29 years old and chronically attached to his device. He slept with it. He drove with it. He would not simply leave it on a counter for me to clone. I looked at the cheap retirement home brochure on the island. My parents had orchestrated this entire nightmare assuming I would fold under the pressure. They sent Trent to clean up the physical remnants of Silas Carter's life while they waited for the bank to clear the funds. I walked over to the sink and picked up the half-eaten apple Trent had discarded. I tossed it into the trash can. I needed to separate my brother from his device, and I needed to do it without raising a single alarm. The bulldozers were scheduled for Friday morning. I had to secure the digital evidence tonight. It was Wednesday afternoon when the gravel driveway crunched under a second set of unfamiliar tires. I was standing near the kitchen sink running cold water over a coffee mug when the sound drew my attention to the window. It was not the corporate surveyors returning, and it was not my brother coming back for more boxes. A pristine pearl-white luxury SUV glided toward the farmhouse, the dealer plates still glinting in the harsh midday sun. My parents had returned from Mexico 2 days early. The offshore wire transfer must have reached a pending status, granting them the financial confidence to purchase a vehicle straight off the showroom floor on their drive back from the airport. I watched as Richard and Diane stepped out of the vehicle. Their skin boasted a deep, rich bronze that looked entirely foreign against the pale golden hues of the Kansas wheat fields. My mother wore a flowing linen resort dress that caught the prairie breeze. My father sported a heavy designer watch that flashed brightly as he closed the driver door. They looked like wealthy tourists who had wandered onto a working agricultural operation by mistake. They walked up the porch steps with a triumphant, unbothered stride, oblivious to the destruction they had set in motion. My mother pushed the front door open, bypassing any greeting, and waved me into the formal dining room. We usually reserved this space for Thanksgiving dinners and funeral repasts. The room felt suffocating heavy with the scent of old wood polish and the overpowering floral perfume Diane had applied before walking inside. She arranged herself at the head of the long oak heirloom table, a piece of furniture my grandfather had carved with his own hands 60 years ago. She began dabbing the corners of her eyes with a folded tissue, setting the stage for her act. My father stood behind her chair, adopting a portrait of solemn responsibility. He rested his hands on her shoulders, playing the role of the protective patriarch. I took a seat opposite them, keeping my spine straight and my hands folded firmly in my lap. Silas remained in his study, refusing to participate in the charade. I represented the defense. Diane initiated the performance. She let out a carefully calibrated sigh, a sound meant to convey the crushing weight of familial sacrifice. Waverly, honey, she began, her voice quivering with practiced fragility. We know the corporate men came. We know you are confused and probably hurt by the news. But you have to understand, we did this for your grandfather. We did this to protect him. I watched my mother's hands. Her fresh acrylic nails, painted a vibrant coral pink, tapped a rapid, nervous rhythm against the polished oak wood of the table. The sharp clicking sound echoed in the quiet room, betraying her simulated sorrow. It was the frantic cadence of someone trying to sell a faulty product before the buyer could inspect the interior. The rhythm was erratic, exposing the anxiety simmering just beneath her fresh tan. The farm was drowning, sweetheart. Diane continued, squeezing her eyes shut to force a single calculated tear down her cheek. Silas was too proud to admit the truth. He was drowning in inescapable debt. The equipment loans, the property taxes, the seed lines of credit, all of it was piling up. We were facing total foreclosure by the end of the year. If the bank took the land, your grandfather would be left with nothing. He would be out on the street with no dignity and no savings. Your father and I stepped in and made the hardest decision of our lives to save him from ruin. I did not react. I did not raise my voice or accuse her of lying. As an actuary, I handle financial disasters daily. I evaluate insolvent companies' model risk projections and calculate bankruptcy distributions. I know exactly what insolvency looks like on paper, and I knew Silas kept his books impeccably balanced. I understand, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. If the farm is insolvent, the numbers will reflect that reality. Please show me the debt statements. I need to see the loan origination documents, the past due tax notices, and the bank foreclosure warnings. If Silas is in the red, we can review the balance sheets right now and plan a structured settlement. The clicking of the acrylic nails stopped instantly. The performative sorrow vanished from my mother's face, replaced by a cold, hard panic. She looked up at my father, silently begging him to intervene. Richard did not handle challenges well. For 30 years, he had operated under the delusion that his physical presence commanded unquestioning obedience. His financial history was a string of failed ventures and leveraged debt, making my mother's claims of his heroic intervention deeply ironic. He slammed his palms flat against the dining room table, rattling the antique crystal glasses in the nearby hutch. You do not know a single thing about high finance. Waverly. Richard barked, his face flushing a dark, angry red beneath his resort tan. You sit in a cubicle pushing a mouse around and playing with calculators. You do not understand asset liquidation or corporate restructuring. I saved this family from collapse. I secured a payout that covers the imaginary debt and secures our future for decades. You are a naive child, and you need to stay out of adult business before you ruin the only good deal I have ever managed to close. He paced the length of the dining room, his leather loafers squeaking against the hardwood floor. You think you can play lawyer and stop this transaction? You cannot. Apex Holdings is not just buying dirt to sit on. They evaluated the geological surveys from the state. This land sits over the deepest, purest section of the county aquifer. They are building a commercial water pumping facility to supply their industrial processing plants across the state line. They are going to drain the reservoir to feed their factories, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars riding on this project. They will crush anyone who stands in their way. When Richard described draining the aquifer, a sickening realization washed over me. The groundwater is the lifeblood of this region. Generational family farms rely on that deep well to survive the brutal summer droughts. If a commercial processing plant installed industrial pumps on our land, they would drain the water table for miles in every direction. My father was not just selling his own heritage. He was selling out every neighboring family who had farmed alongside Silas for 50 years. He was guaranteeing the collapse of the local agricultural community so he could buy a luxury vehicle and a timeshare. The sheer scale of his selfishness was staggering. He straightened his posture, crossing his arms with a smug, victorious grin. In fact, I spoke with David Keller on the drive here. Apex knows you, and the old man are being stubborn about vacating. They fast-tracked the demolition permit through their county connections, bypassing the standard waiting periods. The bulldozers are not just coming Friday. They are crossing the property line at exactly 6 in the morning, and the sheriff will be leading the escort to ensure we vacate the premises peacefully. The barn comes down first, and the well drillers start digging by noon. The deal is done, Waverly. Pack your bags. A commercial water pumping facility. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind, forming a clear, undeniable picture. Apex Holdings did not care about the historic wheat fields. They cared about the water flowing beneath them. My father thought this information intimidated me. He thought the mention of the sheriff and the fast-tracked permits would force me to surrender to his authority. Instead, he had just handed me the exact structural weakness of the entire corporate acquisition. If Apex was buying the land strictly to exploit the aquifer, I needed to check the historical deed records filed in Silas's study. I needed to see who actually owned the water rights beneath the soil, because in Kansas, surface rights and water rights are not always the same asset. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, muting my father as he continued to boast about his high finance connections. I walked out of the formal dining room without uttering another syllable to my parents. I retreated to the study, my mind already organizing the chaos into actionable datasets. I sat down at the mahogany desk and opened my laptop. I drafted a concise email to my managing partner in Kansas City. I requested an emergency leave of absence effective immediately, citing a critical family legal crisis. My firm valued my risk assessment models, and they approved the request within 5 minutes. I was now off the clock for them, which meant I was fully on the clock for my grandfather. I navigated to the financial databases I utilized daily for corporate audits. Apex Agricultural Holdings operated as a publicly traded entity, which meant their quarterly filings and strategic acquisition goals were accessible if you knew where to look. I sifted through their recent investor prospectuses. The documents outlined a heavy pivot toward industrial resource extraction, specifically targeting regions with vulnerable local economies. I opened a secondary tab and pulled up the current agricultural land valuations for our specific county in Kansas. The average going rate for raw, uncultivated farmland hovered around $4,000 an acre. I compared that figure against the redacted purchase agreement I had reviewed earlier. By reverse engineering the transfer taxes associated with the fraudulent deed, I calculated the exact amount Apex had authorized for the sale. The number was staggering. They had paid nearly $40,000 an acre. A conglomerate does not overpay by a factor of 10 out of generosity. They overpay because the hidden yield justifies the initial expenditure. My father was right about one specific detail. Apex was not buying the dirt. They were purchasing exclusive access to the subterranean aquifer. They intended to siphon the water table dry, process the resource, and leave the surrounding agricultural community to wither. The study door creaked open. Silas walked in carrying 2 ceramic mugs of dark steaming coffee. He set one down near my keyboard. "They are coming for the water, Grandpa," I said, keeping my tone hushed. "My parents sold the land, but Apex is paying for the aquifer underneath it. They plan to build a commercial pumping station." Silas lowered himself into his leather armchair. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The lines around his eyes deepened, not with fear, but with a profound nostalgic amusement. He looked toward the window out at the vast expanse of green winter wheat. "Your father always lacked foresight," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He thinks wealth only exists in the things you can see and touch today. He never understood the history of this region." Silas set his mug on a coaster. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "In the summer of 1988, we suffered a drought that nearly broke this entire county. The sky did not yield a drop of rain for 4 months. The soil turned to powder. Neighboring families lost their livelihoods, packing up their trucks and abandoning farms that had been in their names for generations. I remembered hearing fragments of the 1988 stories during my childhood, tales of dust storms and ruined crops. But Silas had rarely spoken of his own struggles during that time. That year, Silas continued, "I realized that owning the surface of the earth meant nothing if you could not control the life flowing beneath it. So I hired a brilliant local judge who understood property law better than anyone in the state. We executed a severability clause." My hands stopped hovering over the keyboard. A severability clause. "I legally severed the subterranean water rights from the surface deed," Silas explained. "The transaction is buried in a historical county charter, locked away in a separate entity entirely. Whoever holds the physical surface deed to this farm only owns the top 6 inches of topsoil. They have zero legal authority to drill a commercial well or extract a single drop of water from the aquifer." A cold, triumphant clarity settled over me. My parents had orchestrated a highly illegal covert operation to sell the farm. Apex Holdings had transferred millions of dollars in a rushed under-the-table acquisition. And they had both just purchased a 400-acre sandbox. "We need the charter," I said, standing up from the desk. "If we can attach the 1988 severability document to an emergency filing, we can prove that Apex bought a worthless asset. It will freeze the demolition." Silas pointed toward the tall steel filing cabinet in the far corner of the study. Bottom drawer. Blue folder. I hurried across the room and reached for the brass handle. Before my fingers could grasp the metal, heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. The study door flew open. Trent barged into the room, his designer boots thudding against the hardwood floor. He smelled of expensive cologne and sheer desperation. He saw me reaching for the filing cabinet. His eyes darted from the laptop on the desk to the open drawers. He lunged across the room, shoving his shoulder into the steel cabinet. The impact rattled the metal frame. He slid a heavy brass padlock through the security latch mechanism, clicked it shut, and shoved the key into the front pocket of his jeans. "You really think you are smarter than everyone else?" Trent sneered, his chest heaving. "Mom and Dad figured you would try to dig up some outdated contract to slow down the transition. This cabinet stays locked until the bulldozers clear the yard. You are not ruining my payout." He stood guarding the steel box, puffing out his chest, wearing the arrogant grin of a man who believed physical obstruction equated to tactical victory. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to pry the key from his pocket. I simply looked at him, feeling a deep, profound pity for his ignorance. Trent operated in a world where locking a piece of paper inside a metal box meant the information ceased to exist. He did not understand that a county charter is a matter of public record. The paper in the drawer was merely a copy. The original lived at the courthouse. "Keep the key." "Trent," I said, picking up my purse and my car keys from the desk. I walked out of the study, leaving him standing guard over a useless cabinet. I exited the farmhouse, climbed into my sedan, and fired up the engine. I spun the tires on the gravel, accelerating down the long driveway toward the county seat. The courthouse was a sprawling limestone building situated in the center of town. I jogged up the concrete steps, pushing through the heavy glass doors. I navigated the familiar hallways, bypassing the bustling traffic court and heading straight for the county clerk and recorder office. I approached the counter and presented my identification, along with a certified copy of the Irrevocable Agricultural Conservation Trust Silas had entrusted to me. The clerk, a woman who had known my family for decades, reviewed the documents with a furrowed brow. "I need to file an emergency ex parte injunction against Apex Agricultural Holdings," I instructed, my voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "I am initiating an actuarial freeze on the property title. The current transaction involves severe fiduciary interference and verified structural fraud. Furthermore, I need you to pull the 1988 severability charter linked to Silas Carter." The clerk typed rapidly on her keyboard. She retrieved the historical microfilm records verifying the 1988 charter that severed the water rights from the surface deed. She attached the documentation to my emergency injunction form. She stamped the paperwork with a heavy, satisfying thud. The red ink bled into the white paper, making it official. "The land title is officially frozen," the clerk confirmed, handing me the receipt. "No heavy machinery can legally enter the premises until a judge reviews the conflicting deeds." "How long does the freeze last?" I asked, tucking the paperwork into my leather bag. 48 hours, she replied. After that, they can appeal the hold and request a police escort to enforce their claim. I walked back out to the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun beat down on the limestone pillars. I had outmaneuvered my brother and legally stalled a corporate giant. I had successfully altered the risk profile of the acquisition. But the victory was temporary. I had secured a mere 48 hours of borrowed time. The clock was ticking, and Apex Holdings would not simply accept a bureaucratic delay. They would send someone to ensure the demolition proceeded as planned. The drive back from the county courthouse offered a brief window of quiet, but my mind did not rest. I mentally cataloged the filings, the stamped dates, and the statutory timelines governing property disputes in the state of Kansas. The 48-hour injunction provided a shield, yet a shield only delays an inevitable strike. I turned my sedan onto the familiar gravel driveway, the tires crunching over the uneven path. A vehicle was already parked near the front porch. It was not my parents' pearl-white luxury vehicle, nor was it the oversized truck belonging to my brother. A sleek silver sedan idled in the yard. The engine purred with a quiet, refined hum that felt out of place against the backdrop of rusted silos and weathered wooden fences. A man leaned against the front fender. He was older than the corporate surveyors who had visited earlier that week. His posture exuded a relaxed, practiced authority. He wore a tailored navy suit devoid of any wrinkles despite the long drive from whatever metropolitan center he called home. I parked my car and stepped out, clutching my leather bag containing the court-stamped injunction. I walked toward the farmhouse, forcing my gait to remain steady. As I approached, my eyes caught a jarring detail. The man wore immaculate polished black Italian leather loafers. He had stepped off the gravel path and planted his feet directly into a shallow puddle of slick, dark Kansas mud. The pristine leather sank slightly into the wet earth, the high-gloss finish instantly smeared with grime. He did not seem to notice, or perhaps he simply did not care. The shoes were expendable to him. Everything on this farm was expendable to him. "Miss Carter," the man said. His voice was smooth, carrying the measured cadence of a seasoned negotiator. "My name is Marcus Reed. I handle risk mitigation for Apex Agricultural Holdings." I stopped a few feet away, maintaining a calculated distance. "You are a long way from a boardroom, Mr. Reed." He offered a thin, humorless smile. "I go where the complications are. And right now, you are a complication. David Keller informed me about your little trip to the courthouse this afternoon. An emergency injunction based on a historical severability clause. It was a clever move. I will admit we did not anticipate a rural actuary digging up a 1988 charter to freeze a land transfer." I kept my expression blank. "It is not a clever move. It is a legal reality. You purchased a surface deed. You have no right to the aquifer and your demolition permits are invalid." Marcus Reed uncrossed his arms and took a step forward, his ruined loafers squelching in the mud. "Let us drop the formalities, Miss Carter. We both know how this works. You bought yourself a 48-hour delay. When that injunction expires, our legal department will file a motion to dissolve the hold. If you contest it, we will initiate a comprehensive discovery phase. We will depose your grandfather. We will request decades of financial records, medical histories, and psychiatric evaluations." He tilted his head, his eyes hardening into twin points of cold calculation. "We will drag Silas into a courtroom in Kansas City every week for the next 3 years. We will drown him in procedural motions. We will bleed his savings dry with legal fees before a judge ever rules on the water rights. He is 84 years old. How many years of litigation do you think his heart can withstand before he surrenders or simply expires?" The threat hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. It was a classic corporate attrition tactic. They intended to weaponize the legal system to exhaust an elderly man until he forfeited his home out of sheer fatigue. My parents had sold us to a predator. I did not flinch. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, controlling the rhythm of the conversation. "Mr. Reed," I said, my voice dropping into the precise clinical register I used during board presentations. "You are assuming this conflict remains confined to a local civil court. You are factoring in legal fees, but you are neglecting the reputational risk matrix." Reed frowned, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. "Apex is a publicly traded conglomerate." I continued, stepping closer. "Your closing share price today was $42.15. Your quarterly earnings call is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Your board of directors is heavily reliant on environmental, social, and governance mutual funds to maintain your market capitalization." I watched his eyes. The easy confidence began to fracture. "If you initiate a protracted legal battle to forcibly evict a disabled octogenarian based on a fraudulently notarized contract, you create a catastrophic public relations liability. I have recorded audio of my brother confessing to the forgery. I have the digital footprint of the corrupt notary. If I release that evidence to the financial press, algorithm-driven trading bots will instantly flag the fraud keywords associated with your ticker symbol." I ran the math aloud, ensuring he heard every single digit. "Given the current market volatility, a verified fraud scandal linked to your core acquisition strategy will trigger a panic sell-off. I project a 5 to 7% drop in your stock price within the first hour of the market opening. That equates to a market cap loss of approximately $400 million. I held his gaze, unblinking. "Are you willing to wipe out $400 million of shareholder equity over a water pump in Kansas? Because I promise you, I will make that trade." Marcus Reed stared at me. The polished corporate fixer who had arrived to intimidate a naive farm girl realized he was standing across from a peer. His threat relied entirely on emotion and fear. My defense relied on immutable mathematics. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin ashen. He did not utter another word. He turned on his heel, his ruined Italian loafers leaving deep, muddy footprints on the gravel. He climbed into his silver sedan, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I let out a slow, controlled breath, the adrenaline vibrating in my fingertips. I turned toward the tractor shed, seeking the quiet isolation of the barn to organize my next sequence of filings. The scent of hay and old lumber offered a brief moment of solace. That peace shattered the moment I crossed the threshold. My father stepped out from the shadows near the grain bins. Richard held his mobile phone in his hand, his knuckles white from gripping the plastic casing. He had shed his resort linen shirt for a tailored jacket, but his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had clearly received a phone call from the county clerk, or perhaps the Apex legal team, regarding the frozen title. "You filed an injunction." Richard hissed, his voice echoing off the high wooden rafters. He closed the distance between us, his heavy footsteps thudding against the dirt floor. I held my ground, clutching the leather bag against my side. "I filed a legal hold to stop you from stealing a farm you do not own." "Stealing?" Richard scoffed, throwing his arms wide. "I am saving this family. That land is my inheritance. Silas has sat on this dirt for decades, hoarding equity, while the rest of us scrape by. I finally orchestrated a deal that secures real generational wealth, and you are destroying it. You are ruining the only chance we have to be financially secure. Your version of financial security involves committing federal wire fraud and displacing your own father," I replied, my tone flat and unwavering. "The trust Silas signed 3 weeks ago overrides your fake power of attorney. The sale is dead." Richard stopped pacing. He stood a few feet away, breathing heavily. A cold, calculating gleam replaced the blind rage in his eyes. He slowly slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. "You think that trust protects him?" Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "A trust is only valid if the individual signing it possesses the mental capacity to understand the document. Silas is 84. He forgets names. He misplaces his keys. He had a heart episode 5 years ago that restricted his oxygen flow." A chilling realization crept up my spine. I saw the new vector of attack forming in his mind. "I am his son." Richard continued, stepping closer. "I have medical contacts in Kansas City. I can easily arrange for an independent physician to evaluate him. When a doctor officially declares him mentally incompetent, suffering from advanced dementia, that trust you are so proud of becomes void. The court will reinstate my power of attorney, and I will sign the demolition permits myself." He leaned in his shadow, falling over me in the dim barn light. "You bought yourself 2 days, Waverly. Enjoy them. By Friday morning, I will have the medical order in hand, and I will personally watch them tear this place to the ground." My father left the barn, leaving behind the hollow echo of his threat. I did not panic. An actuary knows that when an opponent reveals their strategy, they surrender their advantage. Richard intended to attack Silas through a medical competency hearing. I walked back to the farmhouse, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. Silas sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. I took a seat beside him and detailed my father's plan. I explained the mechanics of a competency evaluation. Silas did not flinch. He simply blew a thin wood shaving from his knife and nodded. Silas kept meticulous records long before personal computers existed. He possessed a mind that cataloged weather patterns, seed varieties, and commodity market fluctuations with terrifying precision. We spent the evening rehearsing not what to hide, but exactly what to reveal. The following morning, a sleek silver sedan parked next to my parents' luxury vehicle. Richard and Diane stepped out, flanked by a man in a crisp, tailored suit carrying a leather medical bag. This was the hired physician. He possessed the polished, indifferent demeanor of a professional expert witness. Someone compensated generously to provide diagnoses that aligned with the payer's objectives. Diane wore a soft cashmere cardigan, clutching her hands to her chest in a display of manufactured maternal worry. She looked at the peeling paint on the porch railing and sighed heavily, performing for the doctor. They climbed the steps and entered the kitchen without knocking. Silas sat at the island, staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee. He wore a faded flannel shirt buttoned unevenly. He let his jaw go slack, his eyes wandering toward the window. I stood by the sink, maintaining my role as the helpless granddaughter. Richard introduced the man as Dr. Eris. The doctor set his bag on the counter, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He smiled, a tight, patronizing smile meant for toddlers and the elderly. "Silas," the doctor said, speaking far too loudly. "Your son tells me you have been having some trouble remembering things lately. We are just going to have a little chat." Silas blinked slowly, turning his head as if the sound took a moment to register. He looked at Richard, then back to the doctor. "Who are you?" Silas asked. His voice sounded thin and raspy. Diane placed a hand on the doctor's shoulder, shaking her head in feigned sorrow. "It breaks my heart to see him like this," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "He hardly recognizes his own home." Dr. Eris pulled a notepad from his pocket. He asked Silas to name the current president. Silas gave the name of a man who had been out of office for 2 decades. The doctor scribbled a note. He asked Silas to draw the face of a clock showing 10 minutes past 11. Silas picked up the pen with a trembling hand and sketched a lopsided circle, placing the numbers in the wrong quadrants. My father crossed his arms, exchanging a triumphant glance with my mother. They believed the trap had closed perfectly. The doctor closed his notepad with a soft snap, projecting an aura of grim finality. "Well," Richard the doctor murmured, maintaining his clinical facade. "The cognitive decline is evident. I can prepare the competency waiver for your signature this afternoon. Once filed, you will have full medical and financial authority reinstated." Richard nodded solemnly, though his eyes gleamed with greed. "Thank you, doctor. It is a tragedy, but we have to protect him from himself." Silas cleared his throat. The raspy, fragile quality vanished instantly. He sat up straight, his spine aligning like a steel rod. He buttoned the misaligned button on his flannel shirt with swift, steady fingers. "Before you sign anything, Dr. Eris," Silas said, his voice dropping into a resonant, authoritative baritone, "I suggest you evaluate the liability of committing medical fraud." The doctor froze. Richard uncrossed his arms, his triumphant expression faltering. Silas folded his hands on the table. "In 2016, we planted hard red winter wheat on the north 80 acres. We averaged 42.4 bushels per acre despite a late April freeze. The moisture content at harvest was 11.2%. We sold the crop on July 12th for $4.38 a bushel." The kitchen fell dead silent. In 2017. Silas continued, locking eyes with the physician. "We rotated to sorghum. The yield was 89.7 bushels per acre. We contracted early, securing a basis of -20 cents against the December futures board, locking in a cash price of $3.91. Silas did not stop. He recited the exact planting dates, the rainfall totals down to the 10th of an inch, the fertilizer application rates, and the precise gross revenue for every single harvest over the past decade. He rattled off complex derivative pricing models and hedging strategies that most junior brokers could not comprehend without a spreadsheet. The data flowed from him in an uninterrupted, flawless stream of statistical brilliance. I watched the doctor's face drain of color. A physician trained to spot genuine cognitive impairment knows the difference between a failing mind and a calculated performance. Dr. Eris realized immediately that he had been manipulated into participating in a criminal conspiracy. "You asked me to draw a clock," Silas said, leaning forward. "I suggest you draw your own conclusions about the ethical board review that will follow if you attach your medical license to a fraudulent competency waiver." Dr. Eris shoved his notepad into his pocket. He grabbed his leather bag from the counter. He turned to my father, his face flushed with professional terror and embarrassment. "You told me he was severely impaired," the doctor hissed. "You lied to me. I am not signing a single piece of paper for you. Do not ever contact my office again." The doctor stormed out of the kitchen. The screen door slammed shut behind him. His tires spun in the dirt as he sped away from the farmhouse. The silence left behind was deafening. Richard stared at the door, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his temple. His surefire strategy to bypass the injunction had just evaporated. He had no medical authority. He had no legal standing. He had lost the element of control he so desperately craved. Diane stepped forward, her cashmere cardigan suddenly looking absurd. The manufactured maternal worry vanished, replaced by a cold, venomous fury. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. You think this is over? Waverly, she spat, her voice trembling with genuine rage. You think you can humiliate us and steal our future? I did not steal anything, I replied, my tone remaining neutral and detached. I simply secured the asset against unauthorized liquidation. Diane grabbed her purse from the table, her knuckles white. We tried to handle this quietly, she said. We tried to keep the family dignity intact. But if you want to play dirty, we will show you exactly how this town handles a thief. My parents left the farm, but they did not leave the fight. Diane understood the cultural fabric of our rural Kansas community. She knew that in a town where generation after generation attended the same churches and shopped at the same hardware stores, public perception often outweighed legal reality. If she could not win in a courtroom or a doctor's office, she would win in the court of public opinion. The pivot was swift and devastating. By that evening, the whispers began. Diane called her old friends, the women who organized the county fairs and ran the school bake sales. She deployed a new narrative, weaving a story of a tragic family crisis. She told them that her daughter, driven mad by the stress of city living, had returned to the farm and suffered a mental break. She spun a tale that I was holding Silas hostage in his own home. She claimed I was forcing him to live in squalor, manipulating his finances, and preventing his loving son from providing necessary medical care. She painted herself as the heartbroken mother desperately trying to save her elderly father-in-law from a greedy, unstable granddaughter. I am an actuary. I know that misinformation spreads faster than facts. It follows a predictable exponential growth curve, especially within insular networks. The people in this town had known Diane for decades. She was the charming, put-together wife of a prominent local figure. I was the quiet girl who had moved away to the city to crunch numbers. The following afternoon, the theoretical math became a harsh reality. I drove into town to pick up groceries and a few hardware supplies for the barn. I needed to replace a rusted padlock on the equipment shed to protect our physical assets. When I walked into the local diner to grab a coffee, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Conversations stopped. Eyes darted away. People I had known since childhood suddenly found their shoes fascinating. The waitress, a woman who usually greeted me with a warm smile and a menu, handed me my coffee in rigid silence and walked away without leaving a receipt. The isolation was swift and efficient. My mother had successfully turned the community into a weapon, wrapping a tourniquet around my social lifeline. The town had chosen their side. I was now fighting a corporate giant, my own family, and the very community I grew up in. I needed undeniable proof to break the siege, and I knew exactly whose digital footprint held the key. The isolation hardened like frost over the next 24 hours. In a rural farming community, the social ecosystem relies on a delicate balance of trust, shared history, and generational loyalty. My mother understood this architecture perfectly. She knew that in a town where Sunday sermons emphasized honoring your mother and father, casting me as the ungrateful, unstable daughter was a flawless strategy. The cold shoulder I experienced at the diner was merely the first symptom of a systemic infection. I walked down the main aisle of the local hardware store later that afternoon, carrying a heavy brass padlock. I needed to secure the equipment shed before nightfall. The owner, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had sold Silas his first set of socket wrenches 40 years ago, stood behind the cash register. Usually, he would offer a warm greeting, ask about the winter wheat yield, and offer a piece of unsolicited advice about tractor maintenance. Today, he focused intently on a stack of carbon copy invoices. When I placed the padlock on the counter, he processed the transaction in rigid silence. "How is Silas doing?" Mr. Henderson asked. His tone was not conversational. It sounded like an interrogation. "He is doing well," I replied, handing him a $20 bill. "We are just securing a few things around the yard." Mr. Henderson took the money, his jaw set in a tight line. It is a shame what happens to a man's mind when he gets to that age. It is a bigger shame when family takes advantage of it. "Your mother was in here this morning." She looked heartbroken, Waverly. Just heartbroken. He slid the change across the glass display case, refusing to meet my eyes. He had known me since I was a child, yet he convicted me based on a single tearful performance by my mother. I stepped out into the afternoon heat, the brass padlock heavy in my pocket. The silence from the town was not merely hurtful. It was tactically devastating. In a legal battle against a corporate entity, local optics carry significant weight. If a county judge saw a community rallying around an elderly farmer, they might hesitate to lift a protective injunction. If they saw a town shunning a supposedly erratic granddaughter, the path cleared for Apex Holdings. My parents had effectively neutralized my local allies, leaving Silas and me entirely isolated on those 400 acres. I returned to the farmhouse and locked the shed, sealing our physical assets against trespassers. But physical barriers meant nothing against the bureaucratic clock ticking down on my laptop screen. The 48-hour actuarial injunction I had secured at the courthouse was bleeding away. It was Thursday evening. By dawn on Friday, the legal hold would evaporate. Apex Holdings would not hesitate. Their legal department had likely already drafted the motion to dissolve the freeze, waiting for the exact minute the courthouse opened to file the paperwork and dispatch the sheriff to enforce the eviction. I sat at the kitchen island staring at the audio file saved on my phone. Trent boasting about $50 and a wink. It was compelling narrative evidence, but it lacked the structural integrity required to void a real estate contract. An audio recording could be contested, labeled as a joke, or taken out of context by a skilled corporate litigator. I needed the bedrock proof. I needed the digital trail connecting my father, my brother, and the corrupt Kansas City notary. I needed the email threads, the bank routing numbers, the geolocation data that proved my father was never in that notary office. That data lived on Trent's devices. My brother existed in a state of perpetual digital carelessness. Trent spent his late 20s launching a series of failed lifestyle brands, subsidized entirely by my parents. His most recent venture, a premium artisanal beef jerky company that never actually produced any beef, had cost my father $50,000 in marketing fees alone. Trent believed passwords were an inconvenience and treated cybersecurity as an urban myth. He viewed himself as untouchable, shielded by his status as the favored son. That arrogance was his primary vulnerability. I knew his routines intimately. Thursday nights in our county meant dollar draft beers at a local bar called the Rusty Plow. Trent never missed a Thursday night. He considered holding court at the corner booth, buying rounds with my parents' money, a vital component of his personal brand. He would leave his apartment around 8 in the evening and would not return until well past midnight. The actuarial calculation was simple. The risk of breaking into his apartment carried severe legal consequences, including potential felony trespassing charges. The risk of doing nothing meant losing the farm, the aquifer, and my grandfather's legacy at Sunrise. I weighed the variables. The choice required no hesitation. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Kansas sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I dressed in dark, unremarkable clothing. I told Silas I needed to run a final errand in town to secure our legal documents. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded from his leather armchair, trusting my methodology. I drove my sedan to the edge of town, parking 2 blocks away from the generic beige stucco apartment complex where Trent lived. The night air hung thick and humid, filled with the hum of cicadas. I walked the remaining distance, keeping to the shadows cast by the flickering amber streetlights. Trent lived on the ground floor, a corner unit facing an overgrown retention pond. I approached his front door, my pulse maintaining a steady, measured rhythm. When we were younger, Trent constantly lost his house keys. To avoid calling a locksmith, he started hiding a spare key in the most predictable locations. I knelt beside a plastic faux stone planter sitting near his welcome mat. I tilted the planter backward. A dull silver key glinted in the dry dirt underneath. His predictability bordered on insulting. I slipped the key into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a soft metallic click. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, and pulled the door shut behind me, plunging the space into darkness. The apartment smelled of stale beer, expensive cologne, and neglected laundry. The glow of a street lamp filtered through the drawn vinyl blinds, casting long horizontal shadows across the messy living room floor. I did not turn on a single light. I navigated the cluttered space, stepping over discarded shoes and unopened mail. I moved with calculated precision, my eyes scanning the room for the target. There, resting on a glass coffee table amidst a pile of empty energy drink cans, sat a sleek silver laptop. The lid was closed, but a small indicator light pulsed on the side, signaling it was in sleep mode. Trent had not even bothered to power the machine down before leaving for the bar. I knelt beside the coffee table and opened my leather bag, retrieving a high-capacity encrypted flash drive. I lifted the laptop lid. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a harsh bluish glow. A password prompt appeared on the center of the screen. I stared at the blinking cursor. My brother lacked the discipline to memorize complex alphanumeric combinations. He relied entirely on his own ego. I typed the name of his failed jerky brand, followed by the year he was born. The screen unlocked, instantly bypassing the security wall and revealing a chaotic desktop filled with unorganized folders and cached web browsers. I exhaled a slow, controlled breath. I had breached the perimeter. The digital evidence tying my family to the real estate fraud was hidden somewhere within this hard drive. I inserted the flash drive into the side port, my fingers flying across the trackpad as I began the search. I had only a few hours before Trent stumbled home from the bar, and less than 10 hours before the bulldozers arrived at Silas's gate. The harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminated a cluster of empty green beer bottles cluttering the glass coffee table. The condensation rings had dried into sticky circles on the glass, a testament to my brother ignoring basic cleanliness. I knelt on the cheap carpet, pushing aside a pile of discarded mail, and focused my attention on the digital filing system. My actuarial training requires finding patterns where none seem to exist. People who commit financial fraud rarely store their incriminating evidence under a file named illegal documents. They hide their sins in plain sight, burying them in mundane folders meant to deflect attention. Trent rarely deleted anything. He trusted that the sheer volume of spam and promotional messages would bury his actual correspondence. He lived his entire life with a careless sense of invulnerability, funded by my parents and protected by his status as the favored son. That carelessness extended to his cybersecurity. I bypassed his lock screen by typing the name of his failed beef jerky brand, followed by his birth year. The desktop appeared cluttered with unsorted icons and cached web browsers. I opened his primary email client and applied a series of filter parameters. I searched for attachments sent within the last 3 weeks containing the keywords notary deed and Kansas City. The search engine spun for a few seconds. The results populated the screen. A dozen emails appeared strung together in a single damning thread. I clicked the earliest message. The sender was my father. The recipient was Trent. The subject line read, "Simply the final piece." My eyes scanned the text. Richard had written out explicit instructions, leaving a permanent digital record of his own conspiracy. "Trent, you need to drive to the strip mall on 4th Street in Kansas City. Ask for a man named Vince. Tell him the paperwork is for the Carter estate. Pay him $200 in cash. Do not use a credit card. He will backdate the logbook and stamp the document. Once you have the stamped pages, scan them to me immediately, so I can forward them to the corporate buyer before our flight departs for Mexico." The next email in the chain contained the digital scan of the forged deed. I checked the metadata attached to the file. The timestamp on the transmission was 7:45 in the morning on the day of my grandfather's birthday. My parents were standing in a security line at the Wichita airport at that exact moment. They had orchestrated the entire forgery remotely using Trent as their courier. I clicked through to the final message in the thread. Trent had replied to Richard, attaching a photo of the cash handed to the notary across a laminated counter. Trent included a text that confirmed the audio recording sitting on my phone. $50 and a wink, just like you said. The idiot took less than you offered. I kept the change. This was the bedrock proof. The emails contained the intent, the transaction, and the undeniable timeline that destroyed their alibi. The metadata provided the exact IP address of the scanner. Trent used in Kansas City, rendering any claim of a misunderstanding legally void. I highlighted the entire folder and initiated a transfer to my encrypted flash drive. A small progress bar appeared in the center of the screen. The system estimated a transfer time of 4 minutes. 4 minutes can feel like an eternity when you are trespassing in a hostile environment. I watched the green bar crawl across the screen. 10%. 20%. The apartment remained dead quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen. 2 minutes into the download, a pair of bright headlights swept across the closed vinyl blinds of the living room window. A heavy truck engine rumbled to a halt right outside the ground floor unit. A door slammed shut. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached the concrete walkway leading to the front door. Trent was home early. He usually closed down the local bars on Thursday nights, bragging to anyone who would listen about his impending wealth. Perhaps he got into an altercation, or perhaps a sudden paranoia about his unguarded laptop drove him back. The reason did not matter. The timeline had collapsed. The progress bar on the screen crawled to 80%. The footsteps grew louder, pausing just outside the entrance. I heard the metallic jingle of keys. Trent fumbled with the lock, cursing under his breath. The deadbolt clicked. The transfer hit 95%. I held my breath, my fingers hovering over the side of the laptop. The doorknob began to turn. The screen flashed a small notification indicating the download was complete. I ripped the flash drive from the port and snapped the laptop lid shut. The sudden absence of the harsh blue light plunged the living room back into darkness. The front door swung open, allowing a wedge of amber streetlight to cut across the floor. Trent stumbled inside, kicking the door shut behind him with his heel. I dropped to my hands and knees, scrambling behind the faux leather sofa as Trent reached for the wall switch. The overhead lights flickered on, flooding the room with a sickly yellow glow. Trent let out a heavy sigh, tossing his keys onto the kitchen counter. He walked toward the refrigerator, his back turned to the living room. I crawled backward, moving silently toward the short hallway that led to his bedroom. I rounded the corner just as Trent popped the tab on a canned beverage. The bedroom was dark. I slipped inside and closed the door until only a tiny crack remained. I moved toward the single window overlooking the overgrown retention pond at the rear of the building. The latch was rusted, requiring a steady, forceful push to disengage. It gave way with a soft squeak. I slid the glass pane upward, removed the flimsy wire screen, and climbed onto the sill. I dropped the 3 feet to the ground, landing in a patch of damp, foul-smelling mud. I crouched low, pressing my back against the stucco exterior wall. Inside the apartment, I heard Trent walk into the living room. I heard the confused, angry grunt he made when he realized his laptop sat at a different angle on the table. He knew someone had been there. I did not wait to hear what he did next. I sprinted through the shadows, circling the perimeter of the complex until I reached my sedan parked 2 blocks away. The humid Kansas night air burned in my lungs. I locked myself inside the car, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had the weapon. The encrypted flash drive sitting in the palm of my hand contained enough evidence to send my father and my brother to federal prison. It was enough to void the Apex Holdings contract permanently. I reached into my bag to retrieve my phone, intending to call Silas and share the victory. The screen illuminated with a missed call and a new voicemail. The caller identification displayed the direct office line of the county clerk I had spoken with earlier that day. I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting for the audio to connect. The clerk sounded deeply apologetic, her voice hushed and rushed. "Waverly, I am so sorry to leave this on a message, but you need to know right now. Apex Holdings did not wait for your 48-hour injunction to expire. They sent their corporate legal team to a private dinner with a county judge tonight. The judge signed an emergency order vacating your actuarial freeze, citing immediate economic harm to the county infrastructure. The injunction is gone. The sheriff has been instructed to clear the property. The demolition crews are not waiting until business hours. They are staging their equipment right now. The bulldozers are coming at dawn." I lowered the phone, the screen casting a pale glow across the steering wheel. The silence of the car felt suffocating. I had successfully extracted the digital proof required to expose my family, but corporate power had rewritten the rules of the game while I was hiding in the mud. Apex Holdings bought a judge, bypassing the law entirely. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was past midnight. The sun would rise in less than 6 hours. I started the engine, shifted into drive, and sped toward the farm. I possessed the evidence to win a trial, but there would be no trial if the historic barn and the winter wheat fields were reduced to rubble before the courthouse opened. The sky transitioned from deep indigo to a pale, bruised purple, signaling the start of Friday. The morning air held a sharp chill carrying the scent of damp earth and crushed winter wheat. For 4 generations, this sunrise meant the start of a quiet, purposeful day of labor. Today, the sunrise brought the executioners. I stood beside my grandfather at the edge of the property line. A heavy wrought iron gate chained and secured with the new brass padlock I had purchased hours earlier separated our driveway from the county road. Silas wore his best denim jacket and a wide-brimmed felt hat. He leaned on his wooden cane, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not tremble. He watched the approaching storm with the serene stoicism of a man who had weathered tornadoes and droughts, understanding that panic never altered the weather. The silence of the rural morning shattered. The low, rhythmic rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the soles of my boots. A caravan of industrial machinery turned onto the dirt road leading to our farm. 3 yellow bulls, their hydraulic pistons gleaming in the early light, crawled forward like mechanical predators. Behind them followed a fleet of corporate vehicles and a flatbed truck carrying excavation equipment. The convoy kicked up a thick wall of dust, blotting out the rising sun. I reached into the pocket of my coat, letting my fingers trace the rigid plastic casing of the encrypted flash drive. The digital evidence was safe. The proof of forgery and wire fraud rested in my palm. But evidence requires a venue. It requires a courtroom, a judge, and a legal process. I lacked all 3. The corporate legal team had bypassed the system, purchasing a late-night order to dissolve my injunction. They brought the heavy machinery to ensure the physical destruction of the farm preceded any further legal maneuvers. The lead vehicles parked along the shoulder of the county road. The doors opened, and the antagonists stepped into the morning chill. My parents emerged from their pearl-white luxury SUV. Richard wore a tailored blazer over a crisp button-down shirt, dressing for a victory lap. He smiled a wide, triumphant expression, confident that his offshore bank account was about to receive a generational payout. Diane walked beside him, shivering slightly in a thin designer trench coat, her fresh acrylic nails clutching a thermal coffee cup. Trent climbed out of the back seat wearing dark sunglasses to shield his bloodshot eyes. He looked exhausted, nursing a hangover from his Thursday night bar crawl. He had no idea his laptop had been breached. He had no idea he had already handed me the weapon. Marcus Reed, the corporate fixer whose Italian leather loafers I had ruined the previous day, stepped out of the lead sedan. He was flanked by David Keller and a team of men carrying clipboards and legal briefcases. Reed walked toward the iron gate, his stride radiating renewed, arrogant confidence. The bought judge had restored his leverage. Miss Carter Reed called out, stopping a few feet from the iron bars. He held up a thick stack of papers bearing a fresh judicial seal. I told you your delay tactic was temporary. The county court vacated your hold at 10 o'clock last night. Apex Agricultural Holdings holds the exclusive right of entry, and your presence is now classified as criminal trespassing. Step aside and unlock the gate. I did not move. I maintained my position, placing myself directly between the corporate fixer and my grandfather. The legal hold is vacated, Mr. Reed, I replied, my voice steady, carrying over the idle rumble of the diesel engines. But the underlying contract remains a product of forgery. If you bring those machines onto this soil, you assume full liability for the damages. Richard pushed his way to the front of the group, gripping the iron bars of the gate. His face flushed a dark, angry red. Enough of this nonsense, Waverly. The deal is done. The judge signed the order. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. Open the gate right now, or you are going to leave this property in handcuffs. Diane chimed in from behind his shoulder, adopting a tone of wounded maternal patience. Sweetheart, please. You have caused enough trouble. The whole town knows you are not thinking clearly. Do not make this harder on your grandfather than it already is. Let the men do their work. I stared at my mother, marveling at her ability to weaponize concern while actively facilitating a crime. Before I could formulate a response, the flashing red and blue lights of a law enforcement cruiser cut through the dust cloud. A white county sheriff vehicle pulled up behind the corporate sedans. Sheriff Davis stepped out of the cruiser. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a deeply lined face. He had served this county for 30 years. He knew the soil and he knew the people who worked it. He had known Silas since I was a little girl. The sheriff approached the gate, his expression pulled tight with genuine moral conflict. He did not look at the corporate lawyers or my parents. He looked directly at my grandfather. "Silas Sheriff Davis," said, removing his uniform hat and holding it against his chest. "I am so sorry. I truly am. But the dispatcher woke me up at 4 this morning with a direct order from the county judge. They handed me a signed vacate order. My hands are tied. I have to execute the mandate." Silas nodded slowly, offering the sheriff a look of quiet understanding. "A man has to do his job. I do not blame you." Sheriff Davis turned his attention to me, his eyes pleading for cooperation. "Waverly, the paper that they have is legally binding right now. If you do not step away and open this gate, I have to arrest you for obstruction and trespassing. I brought the bolt cutters. Please do not make me use them. I do not want to put you in the back of my cruiser." Marcus Reed crossed his arms, a smug, satisfied smirk playing across his lips. "You heard the sheriff, Miss Carter. The game is over. Unlock the gate." The rhythmic thrum of the bulldozers grew louder as the operators revved the engines, anticipating the signal to advance. The giant steel blades hovered inches above the dirt road, ready to tear into the earth, ready to erase the historic barn, the winter wheat, and 84 years of my grandfather's sweat. I looked at the heavy brass padlock securing the chain. I looked at my father, who was practically vibrating with greed. I looked at Trent, who stood in the background, entirely ignorant of the digital footprint he had left unguarded. An actuary does not rely on hope. An actuary relies on execution. The timing was critical. If the machines crossed the threshold, the physical destruction would begin, and restoring the land would become impossible. I had to trigger the trap before the sheriff cut the chain. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, slowing my heart rate to a deliberate, measured rhythm. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out my mobile phone. I did not reach for the keys to the padlock. I opened my contact list and tapped the name of my own attorney, Mr. Caldwell, a sharp litigator based out of Kansas City, whom I had retained during my drive back from Trent's apartment. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice pitching higher with sudden anxiety. "Put the phone away." I ignored him. I tapped the speakerphone icon and maximized the volume. The digital ringing echoed sharply in the crisp morning air, cutting through the low hum of the idling heavy machinery. Every eye at the gate shifted to the small device in my hand. On the third ring, the line connected. "Waverly, Mr. Caldwell," said, his voice crisp, clear, and broadcasting loudly for the corporate lawyers, my parents, and the sheriff to hear. "We are fully staged and ready. Do you have the digital package?" I held the phone steady, locking my gaze on Marcus Reed. "I have the package, Mr. Caldwell. I am standing at the gate with the representatives from Apex Holdings and the county sheriff. They are presenting a vacated injunction and preparing to enter the premises." The smug smirk vanished from Marcus Reed's face. David Keller stepped forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Excellent," Mr. Caldwell replied through the speaker, his tone shifting into a calculated, lethal professionalism. "Please inform the representatives from Apex Holdings that as of 6 o'clock this morning, we are prepared to submit the digital forensic evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, detailing a conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud and real estate forgery." Mr. Caldwell's voice resonated from the small speaker, carrying a sharp metallic edge that sliced through the low rumble of the idling bulldozers. "If any representative of Apex Agricultural Holdings breaches that gate, they cross the threshold from an unwitting third-party buyer into an active co-conspirator in a documented felony." Richard gripped the iron bars, his knuckles turning white against the rusted metal. "Shut that off. She is bluffing. It is a pathetic bluff." "Cut the chain, Sheriff." Sheriff Davis did not move. He kept his hands resting near his utility belt, his eyes shifting from my father to the device in my palm. A law enforcement officer survives by reading the temperature of a room, or in this case, a dirt road. The temperature had just plummeted. I ended the call, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not mirror my father's frantic energy. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick black binder. It was pristine, organized with color-coded tabs, the culmination of a sleepless night spent printing and cross-referencing the data I extracted from Trent's laptop. I stepped closer to the gate and slid the binder through the gap in the iron bars, holding it out toward Marcus Reed. The corporate fixer hesitated. For a man who built his career intimidating vulnerable landowners, receiving a structured dossier from a 26-year-old actuary was a deviation from his standard playbook. He reached out and took the binder, the glossy cover stark against his tailored navy suit. Open it to the first red tab. Mr. Reed. I instructed, my tone mimicking the cadence of a boardroom presentation. You will find a certified copy of the Irrevocable Agricultural Conservation Trust. My grandfather executed that document 21 days ago. It transfers the entire title of this property out of his personal estate. The man your company signed a purchase agreement with, Richard Carter, used a stale, revoked medical power of attorney to sell land that Silas no longer owned. Reed flipped open this cover. His eyes scanned the legal header, tracking down to the county clerk's seal and the date. His jaw tightened. Move to the yellow tab. I continued, keeping my pacing steady. Your employer authorized a multi-million-dollar acquisition based on geological surveys of the underlying aquifer. You intend to construct a commercial water pumping facility. However, in 1988, my grandfather legally severed the subterranean water rights from the surface deed. He locked those rights in a county charter that remains active today. David Keller stepped closer to Reed, peering over his shoulder at the pages. The polished arrogance began to drain from both their faces. Apex Holdings just purchased 400 acres of topsoil. I said, letting the reality settle over them. You possess zero legal authority to drill a single well. If you proceed, you are funding a worthless dirt lot. Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though it sounded thin and reedy. They are copies, forgeries. She printed them off the internet to scare you. The judge vacated her injunction last night. The court recognized our deed. Stop listening to this naive girl and knock down this fence. Marcus Reed did not look at my father. He turned the page to the final section marked with a bright blue tab. That brings us to the core liability, I said, my voice dropping to a cool clinical register. The blue tab contains the digital forensic footprint of the real estate transaction. You will find printed transcripts of an email thread between my father and my brother Trent. The emails detail explicit instructions to bribe a Kansas City storefront notary to backdate and stamp the revoked power of attorney. Trent, who had been leaning against the pearl-white SUV nursing his hangover, suddenly went rigid. He pulled off his dark sunglasses, his eyes wide and panicked as he stared at the binder in Reed's hands. Trent always lacked the discipline to cover his tracks, viewing his digital life as a private sanctuary, immune to consequences. His arrogance provided the exact receipts required to dismantle the entire operation. You will also find the metadata attached to the digital scan of the forged deed. I explained, ensuring every word landed with structural precision. The transmission timestamp is 7:45 a.m. on the day of the sale. At that precise, Richard and Diane Carter were checking their luggage at the Wichita National Airport, a 3-hour drive from the notary's physical location. The alibi they constructed for their vacation is the exact piece of data that proves the fraud. I paused, allowing the silence to stretch. The diesel engines behind them purred, a mechanical heartbeat waiting for a command. Until 2 minutes ago, Mr. Reed, Apex Agricultural Holdings, was a victim, I said, locking eyes with the corporate fixer. You were an unwitting buyer tricked by a fraudulent seller. But you are a risk mitigation officer. Your job is to shield your board of directors from exposure. You are now holding verified proof of interstate wire fraud and elder abuse. Reed stared at the printed photograph of the $50 bribe resting on a laminated counter. The color vanished from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. If you instruct the sheriff to cut that chain, or if you order those bulldozers to cross this property line, you are no longer a victim. I stated the mathematical finality, ringing in the crisp air. You become an active participant in a federal crime. You trigger a multi-million-dollar penalty, a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation, and a catastrophic plunge in your shareholder equity. You are standing on the precipice of a $400 million liability. The air grew still. The morning breeze ceased, leaving the dust hanging suspended over the dirt road. Silas stood beside me, leaning on his wooden cane, watching the corporate machinery grind to a psychological halt. Marcus Reed closed the binder. The soft snap of the cardboard cover echoed like a gunshot. He looked at the sheriff, then at the heavy machinery idling in the background. The fixer understood the calculus. A bad real estate deal was a minor quarterly loss. A federal racketeering investigation was an extinction-level event for his career. Reed reached for the black tactical radio clipped to his belt. He pressed the transmission button. "All units stand down." Reed commanded, his voice sharp and urgent over the radio frequency. "Kill the engines. We are aborting the entry. I repeat, kill all engines immediately." A series of mechanical groans echoed down the convoy. One by one, the operators turned their ignition keys. The deep, vibrating rumble of the diesel engines sputtered and died. The sudden absence of sound was deafening, leaving only the distant call of a prairie meadowlark in the quiet Kansas morning. "What are you doing?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with disbelief. He lunged toward Reed, grabbing the sleeve of the man's tailored suit. The judge signed the order. "You have the legal right of way. Tear down that barn." Reed shoved my father's hand away with a look of utter disgust. "Do not touch me. The judicial order is predicated on a valid contract. You handed us a forged document, Mr. Carter. You lied to our acquisition team, you lied to our legal department, and you nearly dragged my company into a federal indictment. It is a misunderstanding." Diane shrieked, rushing forward, her acrylic nails digging into her designer trench coat. Waverly is confused. She stole a laptop. She fabricated those emails. You cannot just walk away from this deal. "The deal is dead," David Keller interjected, stepping back toward the silver sedan. "Apex Holdings is terminating the purchase agreement effective immediately. We are officially withdrawing our claim to this property." Richard stumbled backward, his polished loafers slipping in the loose gravel. His face morphed from arrogant fury into sheer, unfiltered panic. The corporate shield he had relied upon to legitimize his theft had just evaporated into the morning air. Without Apex Holdings backing the claim, he was no longer a savvy real estate negotiator. He was just a man caught holding a forged piece of paper. "You cannot terminate the agreement!" Richard yelled, his chest heaving as he chased after Reed. The escrow cleared. "The funds are already in motion. We have a signed contract." Marcus Reed opened the door to his vehicle and tossed the black binder onto the passenger seat. He turned to face my father one last time. "The funds are in motion," Mr. Carter Reed said, his tone dripping with icy contempt. "But they are not going to your account." "The funds are in motion," Mr. Carter Reed said, his tone dripping with icy contempt. "But they are not going to your account." As soon as Marcus Reed spoke the words, the financial reality began to settle over the dirt road. The corporate fixer leaned against the open door of his silver sedan, his demeanor shifting from defensive to predatory. "My legal department is already on the phone with the clearinghouse," Reed said, his voice flat and clinical. "We authorized a wire transfer of $4 million into your offshore holding account yesterday afternoon. However, standard corporate escrow protocols dictate a 48-hour pending window for transactions exceeding $1 million. The funds have not settled. I just initiated a fraud clawback protocol. The transfer is voided. The money is returning to Apex." The air seemed to leave my father's lungs all at once. He stood frozen, his tailored blazer suddenly looking cheap and poorly fitted against the backdrop of the rusted iron gate. "You cannot do that," Diane shrieked. My mother possessed a lifelong obsession with projected wealth. Growing up, she drove European sedans we could not afford and hosted lavish dinner parties funded by predatory credit cards. She viewed the farm not as a heritage, but as a trapped lottery ticket. The Cancun vacation, the designer trench coat she currently wore, and the pearl-white luxury vehicle idling behind her were not purchased with actual cash. They were financed on high-interest margins secured by the anticipation of the Apex payout. Diane marched toward the corporate vehicles, her previous maternal grace evaporating into raw panic. She pointed a manicured finger at David Keller, her voice cracking under the strain. "We signed a contract in good faith. You evaluated the land. You approved the survey. You cannot just freeze our accounts because some jealous girl printed fake emails." We have debts to clear today." Keller did not even bother to look at her. He climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut, ignoring the woman pounding her fists against the tinted glass. Richard turned away from the departing corporate sedans. His eyes locked onto the black binder I still held in my left hand. His panic morphed into a desperate feral energy. He operated under the delusion that if he could just destroy the physical evidence, he could somehow rewind the clock and salvage the transaction. "Give me that binder!" Richard demanded, his voice a low, ragged growl. He lunged forward, thrusting his arm through the gap in the wrought iron gate. His fingers clawed at the air, aiming for the leather strap of my tote bag. I did not step back. I did not flinch. Sheriff Davis moved with a swift, practiced efficiency that belied his age. The law enforcement officer stepped between my father and the iron bars, planting his heavy boots firmly in the dirt. He raised his hands, pressing his palms against Richard's chest, shoving my father backward with a firm, unyielding thrust. "That is enough," Richard the sheriff ordered. His voice carried the booming, resonant authority of a man who had spent 3 decades breaking up tavern fights and domestic disputes. "Keep your hands on your own side of the fence. You step toward this girl again, and I will put you in restraints." Richard stumbled, his polished leather loafers skidding across the loose gravel. He caught his balance against the hood of his luxury SUV. He stared at the sheriff, his chest heaving, his face slick with a cold sweat. "She is stealing my property." "Davis," my father yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Arrest her. She broke into Trent's apartment. She hacked his computer. That is a crime." I watched my brother flinch. Trent had been hovering near the rear bumper of the vehicle, trying to blend into the shadows of the rising sun. My father had just publicly admitted that the digital evidence originated from his own son's device, inadvertently validating the authenticity of the emails. Trent raised his hands, stepping backward. "Dad, shut up. Do not say anything else." I looked at the 3 of them. My family. They had conspired to leave an 84-year-old man homeless, prioritizing their own luxury over his survival. They had weaponized the local community against me, isolating us in our most vulnerable moment. They expected me to fold. Instead, I recalculated their risk profile. "You do not understand the mechanics of the crime you committed, Dad," I said. My voice carried clearly across the quiet morning, untethered by anger or sorrow. "You viewed this as a simple local real estate transaction. You thought forging a notary stamp in Kansas City and handing it to a corporate buyer would just result in a quiet payday." I adjusted my grip on the binder, letting the weight of the evidence anchor me. "But you did not stay in Kansas to complete the transaction. You boarded a flight to Mexico. You utilized a foreign network to authorize an offshore banking transfer." Richard frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher the legal implications of my statement. "When you execute a fraudulent contract using digital communication networks across state lines, it is no longer a civil dispute," I explained, delivering the final variable in their equation. "And when you attempt to route illicit funds through an international clearinghouse while standing on foreign soil, you escalate the structural severity of the offense." I turned my gaze toward the sheriff, who was listening intently, his hand resting near his radio. My father did not just commit local forgery, Sheriff Davis. He utilized electronic telecommunications to defraud a major corporation and disinherit a vulnerable senior citizen. He triggered the federal wire fraud statute. The words hung in the crisp morning air. Wire fraud. It was a term that carried the weight of federal jurisdiction, mandatory minimum sentencing, and relentless investigations by agencies that did not care about small-town gossip or local reputations. My father opened his mouth to speak, but the oxygen seemed to have abandoned him. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale hue. He looked at the corporate sedans disappearing down the county road, taking his financial shield with them. He looked at the heavy bulldozers, their operators securing the equipment for transport, abandoning the demolition site. Sheriff Davis unclipped the radio from his belt. The moral conflict that had troubled his face earlier had vanished, replaced by the grim resolution of an officer presented with actionable, documented crimes. Richard the sheriff said, his tone devoid of any lingering familiarity. "I need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." "I am not doing that," Richard stammered, taking another step backward. I did not do anything wrong. I was acting in the best interest of the estate. Sheriff Davis unholstered his restraints. The metallic click echoed sharply. I am not asking you, Richard. You and your son are being detained pending a formal inquiry. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will be highly interested in reviewing the contents of that binder. Put your hands on the hood. Now. Trent did not argue. The bravado he displayed while securing the filing cabinet in the study had evaporated. He walked slowly toward the sheriff's cruiser, his head bowed, extending his wrists. He understood the digital trail was undeniable. Richard looked around, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The dirt road offered no sanctuary. He slowly turned, placing his palms flat against the pristine white paint of his new, unfunded vehicle. Sheriff Davis secured his wrists, guiding him toward the back of the patrol car. Diane stood frozen in the center of the driveway. The perfectly curated facade she had maintained for decades shattered. She watched her husband and her favored son secured in the back of a law enforcement vehicle. She watched the corporate lawyers drive away, taking her anticipated wealth with them. Silas stepped forward, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He looked through the iron bars at his daughter-in-law. You can leave now, Diane, my grandfather said. His voice held no malice, only a profound, enduring weariness. Sheriff Davis closed the cruiser door, cutting off my father's frantic protests. The patrol car engine roared to life, reversing down the dirt path, carrying my brother and my father toward a holding cell. Diane did not speak. She did not yell. She simply stood alone in the dust, clutching her designer trench coat against the morning chill. She had traded her family for a fortune, and in the end she was left with neither. She walked slowly toward the empty luxury vehicle, the keys trembling in her manicured hand as the Kansas sun finally broke over the horizon. The federal justice system operates much like an actuarial mortality table. It possesses no emotion, no vindictiveness, and no capacity for forgiveness. It simply processes the data and extracts the inevitable penalty. By Tuesday morning, Richard and Trent were transferred from the county holding cell to a federal detention facility in Kansas City. The United States Attorney declined to offer bail during their initial hearing, citing the undeniable digital footprint of interstate wire fraud and the flight risk demonstrated by their prior trip to Mexico. My father, a man who spent his life projecting unearned authority, now wore an orange jumpsuit stripped of his tailored blazers and his illusions of grandeur. My brother sat in an adjacent cell, his arrogant smirk replaced by the stark realization that a digital footprint never truly vanishes. While the legal machinery ground my father and brother into the federal docket, the voided Apex Holdings wire transfer triggered a catastrophic chain reaction in my mother's financial ecosystem. Diane always treated debt as a minor temporary inconvenience, rather than a binding contractual obligation. She built her entire social persona on the illusion of prosperity funding rural country club dues and European vacations through a labyrinth of revolving credit lines and second mortgages. When my father negotiated the illicit farm sale, Diane assumed the $4 million payout was guaranteed. She did not wait for the ink to dry. Operating on sheer greed, she secured a high-interest bridge loan from a predatory private lender, leveraging the anticipated corporate escrow deposit. That speculative loan funded their Cancun evasion, her designer wardrobe, and the pearl-white luxury vehicle she drove off the showroom floor. When Apex Holdings initiated the fraud clawback protocol, they severed the financial artery keeping my mother solvent. The private lender called the loan within 48 hours. Her credit cards declined. The dealership initiated repossession protocols for the SUV. The foundation of her curated life fractured, leaving her exposed to the crushing weight of her own hubris. 10 days after the standoff at the gate, the pearl-white vehicle crept up our gravel driveway one last time. The SUV was no longer pristine. A thick layer of Kansas dust coated the side panels, and a prominent scratch marred the front bumper. Diane parked near the porch, turning off the engine. She did not step out with the triumphant, unbothered stride she had deployed during our formal dining room meeting. She emerged slowly, her shoulders slumped. Her appearance was jarring. The salon fresh hair dye was fading, revealing stark gray roots. Her resort wear was replaced by a wrinkled blouse and faded jeans. The manicured coral acrylic nails were chipped and broken. Silas sat in his weathered rocking chair on the front porch, the morning sun casting long shadows across the wooden planks. He held a piece of soft cedar and a small pocket knife, methodically shaving thin curls of wood onto the floorboards. I stood near the screen door, a single sheet of printed paper folded in my hand. Diane climbed the wooden steps, her breathing shallow and erratic. She dropped to her knees near the top step, burying her face in her hands. The tears began immediately. She deployed the exact same performance she had used in the dining room, summoning loud, ragged sobs meant to convey insurmountable sorrow. "Silas," she cried, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "You have to help me. They took Richard. They took my boy. The bank is foreclosing on our house in town. The lenders are calling every hour. I have nothing left. We were just trying to secure a future for the family. You have to tell the federal prosecutors it was a misunderstanding. You have to bail us out." I watched her shoulders shake. The display was technically proficient, mimicking the physical symptoms of a breakdown, yet it remained hollow. She was not mourning the incarceration of her husband or her son. She was mourning the loss of her financial safety net. She expected Silas, a man rooted in the deep Midwestern tradition of unconditional family duty, to absorb her debt and rescue her from the consequences of her own theft. Silas did not stop whittling. He blew a thin curl of cedar off the blade of his knife. He looked down at the woman kneeling on his porch, his expression devoid of anger, pity, or resentment. He viewed her with the profound, settling peace of a man who had finally excised a rot from his crop. "You did not try to secure a future for this family, Diane," Silas said, his baritone voice steady and resonant in the quiet morning air. "You tried to bury me in a cheap nursing home so you could buy a new car. You sold your family for the quick buck." Diane lowered her hands, the fake tears stalling as the reality of his tone registered. "Silas, please. I am your daughter-in-law." "You were a guest in my house," Silas corrected, pointing the folded edge of his knife toward the driveway. "And you overstayed your welcome. You played a dangerous game with corporate sharks, Diane. You got exactly what you paid for. I will not spend a single cent of this farm's equity to buy you out of the trap you set for me." The rejection hung in the air, cold and definitive. Diane stared at the elderly farmer, her jaw slack. The realization that her tears held no currency here hit her like a physical blow. She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes narrowing with a desperate, venomous glint. "This is your doing, Waverly," she hissed, pushing herself up from the wooden floorboards. "You turned him against us. You stole my husband and my son. You are going to burn in hell for tearing this family apart." I did not engage with her hostility. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I unfolded the printed document in my hand and extended it toward her. She instinctively reached out and took the paper, her eyes scanning the bold legal header. "That is a formal notice of trespass," I stated, my tone matching the clinical precision of the legal document. "It has been filed with the county clerk and the local sheriff's department. You no longer have permission to enter this property, access the driveway, or contact Silas Carter. If you step foot on this soil again, Sheriff Davis will arrest you." Diane looked from this paper to my face. She searched my eyes for any trace of the obedient, quiet daughter she used to manipulate. She found only a rigid, impenetrable boundary. The actuary had calculated the risk, isolated the liability, and finalized the termination. She crumpled the trespass notice in her fist. She turned on her heel, descending the porch steps with rigid, jerky movements. She climbed into the dusty SUV, the engine sputtering slightly before roaring to life. She reversed down the driveway, the tires kicking up a cloud of dirt that slowly settled back onto the earth long after she was gone. The physical boundary was established, but the social boundary required the town to recognize the truth. In rural Kansas, public records function as the ultimate arbiter of community standing. The whisper campaign Diane had initiated earlier that week relied on controlling the narrative in a vacuum. She had successfully painted me as an unstable villain holding my grandfather hostage. That vacuum shattered on Tuesday morning. The federal docket for the district court is a matter of public record. The local county newspaper, a publication that thrived on property transfers, crop prices, and police blotters, pulled the federal indictment. They printed the details of the wire fraud on the front page. The article laid out the unsealed evidence. It detailed the forged notary stamp, the offshore bank accounts, the fake emails, and the corporate contract that intended to drain the county aquifer for commercial gain. The revelation hit the community like a sudden frost. The town realized that Richard and Diane were not trying to save a failing farm. They were attempting to sell the region's most vital water source to a foreign conglomerate, an act viewed as treason in a community entirely dependent on agriculture. The shift was instantaneous. The next day, Diane walked into the local grocery store to purchase basic supplies, her credit cards having been flagged and frozen. The same women who had listened to her tearful lies earlier in the week now turned their backs. Conversations ceased the moment she entered an aisle. The cashier, a woman who had previously nodded in sympathetic agreement to Diane's fabricated woes, scanned her items in stony, unforgiving silence. The whisper campaign died, replaced by a deafening, localized exile. The community did not yell at her. They did not confront her in the streets. They simply erased her. She became a ghost in her own town, ignored at the diner, shunned at the gas station, and avoided on the sidewalks. In a Midwestern culture that places the highest premium on loyalty and land preservation, Diane Carter had committed the unforgivable sin, and she was forced to live every day in the silent, suffocating aftermath of her own greed. I sat at the kitchen island reviewing the final confirmation of the dissolved Apex contract. The farm was safe. The aquifer remained untouched. The liabilities were neutralized. The ledger was finally balanced, but protecting the asset was only the first phase of the equation. I needed to ensure this soil continued to yield a return for the man who had spent his life bleeding into it. The ledger sat perfectly balanced on the kitchen island screen. I stared at the glowing numbers tracing the finalized legal fees, the voided corporate escrow, and the updated county property taxes. The farm was secure. The aquifer flowing deep beneath the topsoil remained safe from industrial extraction. The immediate crisis had evaporated, leaving behind the quiet, predictable rhythm of rural Kansas. I closed the spreadsheet and looked out the window. The morning sun illuminated the winter wheat, casting long shadows across the fields my grandfather had cultivated for 6 decades. I opened a new tab on my browser and accessed my corporate email account. For 3 years, I had commuted to a glass building in Kansas City running risk assessment models for holding companies and retail chains. I spent my days calculating the statistical probability of failure for ventures. I did not care about protecting assets that existed only on digital ledgers. I looked at the weathered wooden beams of the farmhouse ceiling. Real risk is not losing a percentage point on a quarterly dividend. Real risk is losing the soil that feeds your community. Real risk is letting greed erase your heritage. I drafted a brief formal message to my managing partner. I tendered my resignation effective immediately. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. I did not feel fear or uncertainty about walking away from a lucrative corporate trajectory. I felt a profound, settling clarity. The skills I had honed in sterile boardrooms were meant for this specific patch of earth. The transition from actuary to agricultural custodian did not happen overnight. Silas knew dirt, the weather, and the machinery. I knew the data. We spent the winter sitting side by side at the mahogany desk in his study, blending our expertise. I digitized 4 decades of his handwritten crop yields, creating complex predictive models. I applied statistical probability matrices to historical rainfall patterns, optimizing our planting schedules to mitigate drought exposure. Instead of relying on traditional instinctual commodity sales, I utilized futures contracts and options hedging to lock in profitable margins long before the harvest even began. Silas watched the spreadsheets populate with a quiet, appreciative fascination. He taught me how to read the tension in a tractor belt and how to gauge the moisture of the soil by crumbling it between my fingers. I taught him how to leverage basis risk and navigate supply chain economics. Together, we transformed the farm from a vulnerable family operation into a financially impenetrable fortress. The seasons turned with a steady, reassuring cadence. Winter thawed into spring, bringing the vibrant green shoots of new wheat. Summer baked the earth and autumn delivered a record-breaking harvest. Our optimized hedging strategy resulted in the highest net revenue the property had seen in 12 years. We used the surplus to upgrade the irrigation systems and repair the roof of the historic barn my parents had tried to demolish. During that year, the absence of Richard, Diane, and Trent settled into the background, becoming a quiet, unremarked fact of life. Richard and Trent accepted plea deals to avoid a drawn-out federal trial. They were currently serving sentences in a low-security federal correctional institution in Missouri. The restitution fines wiped out whatever hidden savings they had managed to squirrel away. Diane had relocated to a small, cramped apartment 2 towns over, working as a receptionist at a local veterinary clinic. Her luxury vehicles were gone, repossessed by the lenders she could no longer appease. She sent a single letter in December, a rambling attempt to elicit sympathy and request financial assistance for legal fees. I did not open the envelope. I placed it in the wood stove, watching the paper curl and blacken into ash. A boundary only holds its shape if you refuse to cross it. The calendar circled back to October, marking the passage of 1 full year since the empty birthday cake and the arrival of the corporate surveyors. The kitchen did not smell of stale sugar and aged linoleum this time. The air was thick with the rich, savory scent of roasted beef buttery rolls and spiced apple pie. The solitary blue candle was gone. I stood by the sink drying a stack of ceramic plates. The farmhouse buzzed with life. The long dining room table, the same heirloom oak table where my mother had performed her fake tears, was now crowded with people who understood the true value of loyalty. Sheriff Davis sat near the head of the table, laughing out loud at a joke told by one of our seasonal harvest hands. Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, having long since apologized for believing the Whisper campaign, passed a heavy bowl of mashed potatoes to the local mechanic who kept our combines running. The room hummed with genuine warmth, the kind of community connection that cannot be bought, forged, or stolen. Silas sat at the center of the gathering. He wore a crisp flannel shirt, his posture relaxed, his face illuminated by the soft amber glow of the dining room chandelier. He looked healthier and lighter than he had in a decade. The burden of defending his legacy alone had been lifted. He raised a glass of sweet tea, tapping it lightly with a spoon to catch the attention of the room. The conversations quieted. Silas looked down the length of the table, his eyes settling on me. "A year ago, I thought I was going to lose this place," Silas said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant strength of the earth itself. "I thought the greed of the world had finally caught up to my doorstep. But I forgot that I raised a girl who knows how to count the cost." He raised his glass higher. "To Waverly, the best custodian this land could ever ask for." The table erupted in a chorus of cheers. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed off the wooden beams. I smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression, raising my own glass in return. As the guests finished their meal and began clearing the plates, I slipped out the front door, seeking a brief moment of quiet. I stepped onto the wooden porch, the evening chill biting pleasantly at my cheeks. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the expansive Kansas sky in brilliant streaks of crimson gold and deep violet. I leaned against the porch railing, looking out over the 400 acres of winter wheat. The wind moved through the fields, creating a soft, rolling rustle that sounded like a deep, collective exhale. The land was safe. The aquifer below remained untouched, holding the lifeblood of the county secure within the bedrock. Revenge is often depicted as a destructive force, a fire meant to burn the enemy to ash. But standing on the porch of the home I had saved, I realized the truth. Real justice is not about destroying the people who tried to ruin you. It is about rendering them entirely irrelevant. My parents and my brother sought wealth through betrayal, and it left them with nothing but cold concrete and crushing debt. I chose loyalty, strategy, and hard work. It granted me a life of profound purpose and unbreakable peace. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind and the distant laughter drifting through the farmhouse windows. The legacy was protected. The numbers were balanced. We were safe, untouchable, and enduring. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to stand your ground against the people who should have protected you, remember that your peace is worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to Fluffy Revenge. Leave a comment below if you know the true value of building a life the greedy cannot reach, and I will see you in the next one.
We often hear that the ultimate goal in modern American culture is the attainment of absolute financial freedom. It is a society that champions the self-made individual, frequently measuring a person's worth by the cars in their driveway, the stamps in their passport, and the size of their investment portfolio. But what happens when that relentless pursuit of material success turns inward, cannibalizing the very roots from which a family grows? The story of the Carter family, of Silas's quiet wisdom, Waverly's calculated resilience, and the devastating betrayal orchestrated by Richard and Diane is far more than just a gripping tale of corporate sabotage. It is a profound emotional mirror held up to our own lives, asking us to evaluate the core values we are passing down to the next generation. When we view this narrative through the lens of traditional family responsibility and emotional awareness, it becomes a powerful indictment of modern greed and a masterclass in the art of self-correction. For parents navigating the complexities of raising children today, this story offers a stark warning and a guiding light built upon three fundamental pillars: ethics, wisdom, and fortitude. In a culture that frequently elevates individualism above the collective well-being of the family unit, it is dangerously easy to lose sight of what constitutes true wealth. Richard and Diane fell victim to a tragic, all-consuming ignorance. They looked at an 84-year-old father and a generational wheat farm, and they did not see a legacy of love, sacrifice, or duty. They saw only a dormant asset waiting to be liquidated. Their desire for a flashy lifestyle, characterized by luxury SUVs and careless vacations to Cancun, entirely clouded their moral conscience. When financial freedom is constructed on a foundation of deceit, and when it requires the deprivation of one's own kin, it ceases to be a marker of success. It becomes an instrument of inevitable self-destruction. Families are meant to be sanctuaries of mutual care, not transactional marketplaces where the vulnerable are sold for a quick profit. This brings us to the most vital lesson for any parent seeking to provide long-term guidance for their children. The greatest inheritance you will ever leave behind is not a trust fund, but the blueprint of your character. The universe operates on an immutable law of cause and effect. Richard and Diane sowed seeds of ruthless betrayal and staggering dishonesty. In return, the harvest they ultimately reaped was a devastating combination of incarceration, financial ruin, and absolute social exile. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of their moral failure is visible in their son, Trent. Children are the purest, most uncompromising reflections of our lived values. They do not learn from the lectures we give. They learn from the lives we lead. Trent mirrored his parents' toxic entitlement. He learned to be lazy, dependent, and perfectly comfortable with deceit because that was the silent curriculum taught within his childhood home. Conversely, Waverly became a pillar of unyielding integrity and emotional awareness because she was educated by the quiet, honorable example of her grandfather Silas. As parents, we must constantly ask ourselves what we are teaching our children when we think they are not paying attention. Are we modeling fairness and respect for our elders, or are we showing them how to cut corners to serve our own egos? In raising children with strong emotional awareness, we must also teach them to distinguish between mere cleverness and authentic wisdom. Richard and Diane believed they were exceptionally clever. They thought that forging a notary stamp, manipulating legal documents, and fleeing across international borders was a masterstroke of cunning. But cunning is inherently short-sighted. True wisdom belonged to Silas, a man who possessed the quiet foresight to legally sever his water rights from his surface deed decades before any corporate threat ever materialized. Wisdom is born from stillness, a concept Waverly demonstrated beautifully throughout the ordeal. When faced with her brother's insufferable arrogance, her mother's weaponized manipulative tears, and the heartbreaking betrayal of her entire hometown, Waverly did not succumb to blind rage or paralyzing panic. She maintained her composure, calculated the risks, and waited for the exact right moment to strike. This level of emotional regulation, the ability to remain grounded, observant, and objective when a storm rages around you, is an invaluable survival skill. We must teach our children that true power does not lie in reacting the loudest, but in observing the quietest. Furthermore, this narrative teaches us a harsh but incredibly necessary truth about fortitude and the enforcement of boundaries within a family structure. Society often conflates patience with passivity, but true patience is not weakness. It is the gathering of strength. Waverly endured immense psychological pressure, absorbing the insults and the isolation while gathering her evidence in the shadows. But when the time for action arrived, she moved with decisive, unshakable courage. One of the most difficult lessons in family dynamics is realizing that love does not mean enabling toxic behavior. In traditional family structures, filial piety and respect for one's parents are paramount. However, true fortitude sometimes requires having the courage to protect the innocent from the corrupt, even if the corrupt share your last name. When Waverly handed her own mother a legal trespass warning, it was not an act of cruelty. It was the absolute zenith of moral courage. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do for ourselves and for the future of our children is to decisively cut the ties of a toxic legacy and refuse to let the cycle of manipulation continue. If we wish to guide our children toward a life that is truly prosperous, a life rich in peace, mutual respect, and enduring joy, we must return to the fundamentals of honesty and emotional accountability. We must stop chasing the hollow validation of superficial wealth and anchor our homes in authentic, unconditional love. We must treat our elders with the reverence and care they have earned, proving to our children that human beings are never disposable. If this reflection resonates with your own journey, and if you believe in the power of justice, emotional resilience, and breaking generational cycles of trauma, I invite you to become part of our community. Please follow the channel, Fluffy Revenge, for more stories that challenge the mind, expose the truth, and heal the spirit. As you step away from this story and back into the rhythm of your own daily life, take a long, quiet look at the foundation you are building. Look at the children who are watching your every move, absorbing your reactions, and learning how to navigate the world through your eyes. The soil of our lives is perfectly impartial. It will diligently grow whatever seeds we choose to plant in it, whether they be seeds of greed or seeds of grace. The question is not whether the harvest will eventually come. The only question that truly matters is this: when the autumn of your life finally arrives, what exactly will you be left holding in your hands,